Recently, Ray Ortlund made an Instagram post that said, if empathy is a sin, sin boldly, likely taking a jab at Joe Rigney's book, The Sin of Empathy. Rigney's publisher even quote tweeted Ortlund using the opportunity to promote the book. Rigney is staunchly opposed to empathy, calling it
empathy is the parasitic version of sympathy. So it's a knockoff. It's what sympathy looks like when it goes bad.
But Rigney's argument rests on a logical fallacy. He redefines empathy into something it isn't, distorts its meaning, and then declares it sinful based on that distortion.
Fallacy.
Woo! But contrary to Rigney's claims, Jesus demonstrated empathy in the Bible, and we're commanded to show empathy as a scriptural command. In today's video, I'll break down the difference between compassion, sympathy, and empathy, and defend the goodness of empathy as a biblical virtue. Many debates arise not from actual disagreement, but from failing to define terms properly. It's common for virtues the Bible upholds to have distorted versions in culture. That doesn't mean we abandon the virtue itself, though. Take love, for example. The Bible commands love, but our culture distorts it, saying love is love.
Gay, bi, straight. Love is love.
Using it to justify unbiblical relationships. We even hear this applied to adultery, where a person falls out of love with their spouse and falls into love with a mistress.
Sometimes people fall out of love.
By love, they mean intense emotional feelings that's not anchored in covenant. But do we now redefine love as sinful just because of how culture misuses it? Of course not. The same applies to empathy. Rigney dismisses it as a modern word, which it is. The term originated in the 20th century. But that's actually irrelevant. Language evolves and words gain new meanings. For instance, the word hussy used to mean housewife. That's from the Middle English huswif. Hus meaning house and wif, wife. But today it refers to an immoral woman. Now, if someone were to write a book titled Why Every Christian Woman Should Be a Hussy, it would obviously be silly and offensive because no matter what the word originally meant, what it means today is different. So then the real question is, what does empathy mean today? And is it a good or a bad thing? Let's consult the authoritative sources for English words. Dictionaries.
Look it up in the dictionary.
Now, there are three related but distinct terms in our English language, which have nuanced definitions. They're compassion, sympathy, and empathy. Now, whenever we want to start defining terms, we want to get past individualistic definitions.
Well, that's my truth.
Then look at a common source. If it were a debate over Greek or Hebrew words, we would use a lexicon. But this is a debate over English words. So for those, we want to look to an authoritative English dictionary like Merriam-Webster or Oxford. The Oxford Concise Dictionary defines empathy as, quote, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Oxford also clarifies the difference between empathy and sympathy. They say, people often confuse the words empathy and sympathy. Empathy means the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, whereas sympathy means feelings of pity and sorrow for someone else's misfortune. So empathy involves sharing someone's emotions, while sympathy is simply pitying them. Let's go ahead and look at one more authoritative dictionary, Merriam-Webster. They first make a distinguishment between sympathy and empathy on their dictionary entries. They say, what is the difference between sympathy and empathy? Sympathy is a feeling of sincere concern for someone who is experiencing something difficult or painful. Empathy involves actively sharing in the person's emotional experience. And then they go ahead and add another key distinction between sympathy and compassion. What is the difference between sympathy and compassion? Compassion adds to the emotional experience of sympathy an urgent desire to alleviate the person's distress. So we're not playing the what empathy means to me game.
Well, my interpretation,
but looking at two different authoritative dictionaries, and they both say the same thing. Sympathy is having concern or pitying someone's bad situation, like you can feel sympathy for children starving in another nation. Empathy is where you share someone's emotional experience with them, like weeping with someone who lost a loved one. Whereas compassion is where you try to alleviate someone's distress or suffering, and that would be taking action to fix what is causing the harm in their life. Giving a starving person a meal would be an act of compassion. Now, each virtue has its place. In one situation, sympathy is most appropriate. In another, empathy. And in another, showing compassion. Now that we've defined empathy correctly, let's examine whether Scripture supports it. Romans 12:15 commands, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep." Now, which definition fits "weep with those who weep" best? Is it alleviating distress? Well, no, because grief isn't something you simply erase. Is it pitying their situation? Well, partially, but it does go deeper than that. Is it sharing in their sorrow? Yes, that is what empathy is. A perfect example of biblical empathy is Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Now, look at what Jesus does. He sees Mary weeping, and then it says that he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. What is he doing? He was feeling what she was feeling. And then what does he do? The text says Jesus wept. This is him sharing in her pain by weeping with her. That is empathy. Jesus is sharing in her sorrow, not merely pitying her for her loss. Now, to be fair, Rigney wouldn't say that Jesus was sinning by showing empathy. He'd say it wasn't empathy but sympathy that Jesus was showing. But we know that what distinguishes empathy and sympathy is sharing in their emotion. So it is an example of empathy based on the dictionary definition. In another biblical example of empathy, that of Job's friends, Rigney commends his friends suffering in silence with him as a good example.
They want a shoulder to cry on. Right.
And there's a place for that at a kind of initial level. I think that there's a way in which you enter in, and the first thing you need to do, so Job's counselors did pretty well for about 7 days.
Right.
When
their mouths were shut.
When their mouths were shut and they were just there, what were they doing? They were suffering with him. Right? They were suffering with him. And then they opened their mouths and got it all wrong. But there's a place for kind of allowing the grief to come and to just be present in the pain.
So it's not that Rigney is against true empathy. He just mislabels examples of empathy as sympathy. But what are Job's friends doing? They are sharing in Job's emotional turmoil with him. They are practicing empathy. That's not my definition of empathy. That's the dictionary's definition. Now, Rigney isn't some heartless person opposed to kindness.
There will be no empathy.
His main concern, as he states it, is...
So you lose the ability to actually make an independent judgment about anything that they're saying or doing. In other words, you lose contact with truth. The ability to actually assess. So if you take a scenario where someone is actually hurting, so they're actually in pain, they're actually grieving, and they've been wronged or something like that, and then now there's this expectation, either from them or from other people, show some empathy here. Get in there with them. If you say, well, hold on a minute, I just walked up here, I want to actually think about this situation, I want to maintain some emotional distance in order to be able to evaluate, who did what and when.
Is this true?
Is this true? What's true here? Is the perception accurate that this person, if you want to maintain that distance, that's inevitably alienating to them. That feels like
you clearly hate victims.
Right, you hate victims. You're not actually loving me because I only feel loved if you endorse everything I say, if you validate everything I say.
He argues that empathy leads to affirming everything someone says, making no judgments and losing emotional distance. But here's the problem. That's not what empathy is. He takes a distortion of empathy, infuses the term with that meaning, and then condemns that distorted version as sinful. Listen to him and his host Doug Wilson describe empathy. Ask yourself as you listen if what they're saying sounds like the dictionary definitions we looked at, or if it sounds like a strawman presentation.
Sympathy is coming alongside. Sympathy is compassion. Sympathy is walking with someone in their pain. It's identifying with them, but it's not a total identification.
Right.
You never forget your allegiance to Christ.
Right.
In the identification that you're making with this person,
That's right.
whoever it is. Empathy is headlong, all in.
Right.
Whoever the victim is, or whoever the person demanding the empathy is, they're like God. They will not share their glory with another.
That's right.
They demand everything from you. Sympathy remembers to love God while loving the neighbor.
Yes.
Empathy abandons God for the sake of the neighbor.
Right, turns the neighbor into God.
So, empathy is a total identification with the person, putting them in the place of God, forgetting your allegiance to Christ. Empathy abandons God for the sake of the neighbor. Where is this coming from? None of that is intrinsic to the definition of empathy. They also insist that empathy eliminates emotional separation, making discernment impossible. But that's simply false. I mean, it can, but it doesn't have to. What they're attacking isn't empathy itself, it's a distortion of empathy that no one is defending. Now, Rigney does raise some valid concerns. Emotional manipulation is real, and blindly affirming someone's every feeling can be dangerous. But he misidentifies the culprit. The issue isn't empathy itself, it's its misuse. The problem is distorted empathy that abandons moral discernment or secular empathy detached from biblical truth. But true biblical empathy is good. It is commanded in Romans 12:15, and it's modeled by Jesus. Rigney's mistake is a textbook strawman fallacy. He misdefines empathy, then declares it sinful based on that misdefinition. But when we use correct definitions, the Bible affirms empathy as a virtue. Jesus practiced it, we're commanded to do it. Labeling it as sin only creates confusion, and rejecting it outright is a serious mistake. The real issue isn't empathy itself, it's distortions of empathy that ignore biblical truth. If you'd like to learn more about true and false empathy, pick up Ali Beth Stuckey's book, Toxic Empathy: How the Left Exploits Christian Compassion. She warns of some of the same concerns that Rigney does, but without rejecting empathy. The book description says, "This book isn't about killing empathy. It's about submitting our empathy to God's definitions of love, goodness, and justice."
That's what I'm talking about!
So if that interests you, I've got a link to the book in the video description. Thanks so much for watching. If you found the video helpful, would you mind giving it a like before leaving? I'd appreciate it very much.